going through the first lecture, so let's pick up where we left off with the PowerPoint. Okay, so we're talking about survival needs. The last point that we want to talk about is atmospheric pressure. So specific pressure of air is needed for adequate breathing and gas exchange. We'll talk more about this in EMP2 when we're discussing the respiratory system, excuse me. But in a nutshell, if there's not a atmospheric pressure difference between the pressure within our lungs compared to the pressure outside of our lungs, that is not going to allow us to take in adequate oxygen, which we just learned that we need to allow for our chemical processes and reactions to occur. All right, so moving on to 1.4, talking about homeostasis. I'm pretty sure if you've taken a biology class before, you've heard of this term. So let's delve a little deeper into it. So homeostasis is the maintenance of keeping the internal environment in balance. And we only focus on our internal environment because, unfortunately, we cannot control our external environment. And so internally, the human body works to keep it in balance, to keep it at a state of equilibrium. And that's going to be coordinated by the actions of all of our organ systems together. So the body must constantly be monitored and regulated to maintain homeostasis, meaning that at any second of the day, our body has to be working to, monitor what's going on. Is something off balance? And then if it is, how can we get the body back in balance? So our two primary organ systems that do a lot of this regulating and monitoring would be the nervous system and the endocrine systems. And we do have other organ systems that do this monitoring as well, but those are the main two ones that really do monitor the body's functions, how it's working, and then if there is something that's off, it's usually going to be one of these two organ systems that will send out a message saying, hey, this part of the body is not in balance. Let's go ahead and bring it back in a state of homeostasis. So the variables or factors that can change, like blood sugar, temperature, blood volume, water concentration, and so forth. So in order to control these variables, there's three components of homeostasis that we're going to talk about that we do need to have an understanding so we can see how the body does control, or I should say monitor, its state of balance. So we have to have a receptor. So this is going to be the part of the body that will sense the change or the progression away from a state of balance. So the receptor is going to be the part of the body that will monitor the environment and that will respond to that change. So our receptors could be anything. Let's say we're talking about body temperature. So I'm outside, it's hot outside now. I'm loving this weather, but I'm like, oh gosh, here comes the 90s. So I'm outside, right? And I notice that I'm hot. My body temperature is rising. So the receptor in this scenario is going to be the parts of my bodies that will pick up this increased body temperature. So we've got thermoreceptors that are within our skin and that are within our body that's able to sense body temperature is going above 98 degrees. So then that receptor is going to take that stimulus, that change, that information, and send it to our control center. Now for the human body, our control center, more times than not, will always be our brain. In other situations, it may not necessarily be the brain. It could be the spinal cord. It could even be an endocrine organ, but most times it's going to be the brain. So the control center is going to receive that information. It will determine what is going on. So it'll say, okay, there's an increase in body temperature, and it's going to determine the appropriate response. So body temperature is increasing. It's getting too high. We need to do what? We need to lower body temperature. So the control center, in this case our brain, will send out a message to the effector. And the effector is going to be the part of the body that will actually carry out the response from the control center. So the effector is going to, in this case, be our sweat glands. And the effector will go, okay, we need to activate these sweat glands, so let's start to activate them so that the person can sweat. So then we start to sweat, and we will continue to sweat until the body temperature goes back to normal. Now, The processes of how the effector can either work in a way of negative feedback or work in a way of positive feedback. So negative feedback is going to be our most used feedback mechanism in the body, where the response of the effector will negate or do the opposite of the response of the stimulus, that initial one. So in this case, the initial stimulus is increasing our body temperature because it's hot outside. So the effector, our sweat glands, will do the opposite. It will negate that initial stimulus. So our sweat glands are going to cause our body to sweat so that we can lower body temperature back to normal. The example of positive feedback, and here we have an actual example of your body using the example of how the receptor, the control center, and the effector work together. I'm going to skip through this because I'm essentially saying the same thing by using the example that I'm giving you. And here we have this actual example of how the body keeps us in balance when we're either too cold or we're too hot. Positive feedback is going to be a process of the effector where the response of the effector actually exaggerates the initial stimulus. So it may exhibit a cascade or an amplification of the initial stimulus so that the body can achieve a desired effect. So you might be thinking, when would the body want to move away from homeostasis when it actually wants to do that? Like, what benefit would that have to the body? Think about labor and also think about blood clotting, right? So if a woman begins in labor, she's going to have contractions. And what's the point of the contractions? The point of the contractions are to continue to push the baby into the vaginal canal. And also the contractions cause the cervix to dilate and open up. So the more intense her contractions are, the more her cervix dilates, the more that baby is pushed into the vaginal canal. And this process will occur until the baby is born. So in that case, we do want the body to move away from a state of homeostasis so that we can achieve the desired outcome. Same thing with blood clotting. So when we injure our tissue, we start the process of clotting, and these clotting factors will release chemicals that will recruit more platelets and more clotting factors. So the more that we clot, we're going to release more chemicals to recruit more platelets and clotting factors until we form a plug and stop the process of bleeding. So in those two examples, we actually want the body to move away from a state of homeostasis so that we can achieve a desired outcome. But the difference between positive feedback and negative feedback is positive feedback, once we achieve that outcome, what do you think is going to happen? Do you think we're going to continue to move away from a state of balance? After that baby is born, is the woman going to continue to contract and is the cervix going to continue to dilate? No, the body's going to kick back into a negative feedback mechanism to bring the body back into balance. So with positive feedback, we're using that mechanism, and the response of the effector is going to move the body away from a state of homeostasis until we achieve the desired outcome. Then we're going to have a negative feedback mechanism where we're going to work the body back into a state of balance so that we can keep the body running as we should. And here we have the example of blood clotting as a positive feedback mechanism. So we have a break in our blood vessel wall. Platelets will adhere to the site and release chemicals. And so the more that those platelets adhere to that site, the more chemicals that they're going to be releasing to recruit more platelets there until we plug the blood vessel. Alrighty, so what happens if the body does move away from a state of balance? Is that a problem? And of course, yes, it is. When the body is out of balance, away from homeostasis, we get sick. And that's honestly what getting sick is. The body's not in balance for whatever reason. So when we move away from a state of balance, we have an increase for a risk of diseases and illnesses. This will contribute to changes associated with aging. So as we age, our organ systems don't work as well as they used to. So that allows us to be a little bit more vulnerable to developing illnesses or complications. And if the negative feedback mechanisms become overwhelmed, destructive positive feedback mechanisms may take over. So if for some reason our negative feedback mechanisms are not able to get the body back in balance fast enough and they become overwhelmed with, we've got to do all of this work to bring the body back in balance, the opposite will happen. The positive feedback mechanisms will actually kick in and move the body further away from a state of balance. And an example of this is heart failure, where it's almost too much to bring the body back in balance, so we just continue to move away from a state of balance. And then, of course, if we move away from a state of balance too much, that leads to death. All right, I am done with the first part of this chapter. Click on the link below in your Blackboard folder, and we'll pick up with the second half of this chapter.